Welcome back to Revenge Room. Today's story is called My Daughter-in-Law Knew I Had Spring Break Plans, Still Forced Babysitting. I said no, and that's when she lost control. Imagine this. You have spent years being the reliable one, the one who always says yes, the one who cancels plans, rearranges life sacrifices, peace, all because family asked, and then one day you decide to take a single week for yourself. Just 1 week. A quiet trip. A chance to breathe. But your daughter-in-law shows up at your door demanding you cancel everything to babysit. When you refuse, her face turns red with rage. Your own son calls you selfish. They storm off certain you will cave like you always do. The next morning they return with the children expecting you to open the door and surrender. But all they find is a note. A single piece of paper. And when they read what it says, they start screaming. Because that note is not an apology. It is not a change of heart. It is the beginning of something they never saw coming. What they do not know is that this family has secrets, dangerous secrets, and a plan that has been in motion for 15 years is about to collide with a trap that was set long before any of them realized they were being watched. This story has betrayal conspiracy, a twist you will never predict, and an ending that will leave you speechless. Stay with me until the very last word, because what happens to this daughter-in-law and the people who thought they could take everything from an old man, it is something you do not want to miss. Let us begin. My name is Robert Carter. I'm 68 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent 40 years building bridges and highways across this country. I lost my wife Margaret 3 years ago to cancer, and since then I've been trying to figure out what remains of the man I used to be. The suitcase sat open on my bed, half filled with clothes I had not worn in years. Casual shirts, walking shoes, a paperback novel Margaret had given me the Christmas before she passed, still unread, the spine uncracked. I stood there looking at it all, feeling something I had almost forgotten how to feel. Anticipation. For 3 years I had put my life on hold. I'd been the dependable father, the available grandfather, the man who never said no. When Daniel needed money for the down payment on his house, I wrote the check. When Melissa needed someone to watch Emma so she could attend her yoga retreats and weekend getaways, I rearranged my schedule. When the holidays came, I hosted. When emergencies arose, I responded. I had become a utility to them, as reliable and as invisible as the electricity that powered their comfortable lives. But this week was supposed to be different. I had booked a small cabin on the coast. Nothing fancy, just a quiet place where I could hear the ocean and remember what it felt like to exist for my own sake. Margaret would have wanted this. She always said I gave too much of myself to people who never thought to give anything back. I was folding my last shirt when I heard the front door open without a knock, footsteps in the hallway, quick and purposeful. Then Melissa's voice, bright and demanding, slicing through the silence of my home. She appeared in the doorway of my bedroom, with Emma trailing behind her, my granddaughter's small hand clutching a stuffed rabbit I had bought her 2 birthdays ago. Melissa's eyes scanned the suitcase, and I watched her expression shift from confusion to irritation. She asked what I was doing, though the answer was obvious. I told her I was packing. I was leaving in the morning for a week at the coast. I had mentioned this trip to Daniel twice in the past month, made sure they knew well in advance. Melissa's face tightened. She informed me that she and Daniel had plans this week, important plans, and they needed me to watch Emma. I told her I was sorry, but I had made my own plans. I suggested she find alternative arrangements. For a moment, she simply stared at me as though I had spoken in a foreign language. Then her voice rose, sharp and wounded. She called me selfish. She reminded me of everything they had done for me, though she struggled to name specifics. She said family was supposed to be there for each other, and what kind of grandfather chooses a vacation over his own grandchild? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply said that I had given 3 years of my life being available every time they called, and this 1 week belonged to me. My calmness seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. She pulled out her phone and called Daniel. Within minutes, my son's voice was shouting through the speaker. He demanded to know why I was being so difficult. He called me ungrateful. He asked what was wrong with me, why I only ever thought about myself. I listened to my own child speak to me with contempt, and I felt something close inside my heart quietly and permanently. When he finished, I said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Melissa composed herself and attempted a different approach. She softened her voice and mentioned almost casually that she had some routine insurance papers for Emma that needed my signature. Nothing urgent, she said, just whenever I had time. She would leave them on the kitchen counter. I nodded without commitment. Before they left, Emma broke free from her mother's grip and ran to me. She wrapped her small arms around my waist and pressed her face against my chest. She whispered that she wished she could come with me, that she missed me when I was not around. I held her for a long moment, breathing in the innocent smell of her shampoo, and told her I loved her. Then Melissa pulled her away, and they were gone. I finished packing that night. I woke early, loaded the car, and left before dawn. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't leave an apology. I simply drove toward the coast with the windows down, feeling something that might have been freedom. But I didn't make it to the cabin. The next morning, Daniel and Melissa showed up at my empty house, expecting me to answer the door and surrender as I always had. Emma stood behind them with red-rimmed eyes, and in Melissa's hand was a stack of papers, already bearing my signature documents. I had never seen agreements I had never made. I had not gone to the cabin. That was the truth they would not discover until much later. When I pulled out of my driveway before dawn that morning, I drove past the highway exit that would have taken me to the coast. I kept driving until I reached the city, until I parked in front of a modest brick building with gold lettering on the door that read Brooks Law Office. I had left a note taped to my front door, just 4 words written in my steadiest hand. I need time. Do not look for me. Let them wonder. Let them worry. For once in 3 years, let them feel the weight of my absence instead of taking my presence for granted. Eleanor Brooks met me in her waiting room with the kind of embrace that told me she had been expecting this visit for longer than I knew. She was 58 now, her hair silver at the temples, her eyes still sharp with the intelligence that Margaret had recognized and nurtured decades ago. Eleanor had been my wife's mentee, a young attorney Margaret had taken under her wing when no one else would give her a chance. Now, she ran one of the most respected elder law practices in the state, and she had been holding something for me since the day we buried Margaret. While Eleanor prepared the conference room, I sat alone in the waiting area with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. My mind drifted back to the previous evening, to the moment after Melissa and Daniel had stormed out of my house with Emma in tow. I had stood by the window watching their car reverse down the driveway, and I had seen Melissa raise her phone to her ear before they even reached the street. Her window had been cracked open, and though I caught only fragments of her voice, the words I heard planted themselves in my memory like splinters. "Mom, he actually left," she had said. "You were right. He is harder to control than we thought." At the time, I had dismissed it as Melissa complaining to her mother about her difficult father-in-law. That was what daughters-in-law did, was it not? They vented to their own mothers about the burdens of extended family. But now, sitting in Eleanor's office with the morning light cutting through the blinds, that single word echoed differently. Mom. Not mother, not Patricia, but the intimate conspiratorial tone of someone reporting to a superior. You were right. As if there had been predictions made, strategies discussed, expectations set. Harder to control than we thought. Control. The word settled in my stomach like a stone. Eleanor returned and led me to a small conference room where a metal box sat waiting on the table. She explained that Margaret had arranged this years ago, long before the diagnosis, long before any of us knew she would leave so soon. This was a safe deposit box in Eleanor's care, to be opened only when I requested it and only if I came alone. I asked Eleanor why Margaret had been so secretive. She looked at me with something close to pity and said that Margaret had believed until the very end that she was protecting me from a truth I was not ready to face. Perhaps now I was ready. I opened the box with hands that trembled only slightly. Inside were 2 sealed envelopes, both addressed in Margaret's elegant handwriting. The first read, "For Robert when you need strength." The second read, "For Daniel when he is ready." I stared at my son's name and felt a hollow ache spread through my chest. When he is ready. Not if, when. Margaret had known something was coming for our family. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, methodically and without sentiment. I opened my envelope first. Inside were 3 pages of Margaret's careful script written in the blue ink she always preferred. The letter began, "With love, with memories," with the quiet affirmations of a wife who had spent 40 years building a life beside me. She thanked me for the patience I had shown her, for the forgiveness I had offered when she did not deserve it. She reminded me that I was stronger than I believed, that my silence was not weakness but restraint, and that the time would come when restraint would no longer be enough. Then the tone shifted. Margaret wrote that she had suspicions she could never prove, fears she could not voice without sounding paranoid. She wrote that Melissa had never felt right to her, that there was something rehearsed about her affection, something calculated behind her smiles. She wrote that she had tried to warn Daniel before the wedding, but love makes fools of children, and Daniel had chosen Melissa over his mother's concerns. Margaret did not blame him. She blamed herself for not finding the evidence sooner. The final paragraph stopped my breath. If Patricia Whitmore ever returns to our lives, Margaret had written, be careful. She never forgets, she never forgives, and she has been waiting. I do not know what form her revenge will take, but I know it will come through Melissa. I have prepared what I can. Eleanor has the documents. Trust her as you trusted me. And Robert, my love, do not let them take your dignity. That is the one thing they want most, and it is the one thing you must never surrender. I read the name again. Patricia Whitmore. Melissa's maiden name was Whitmore. Her mother's name was Patricia. I had met the woman perhaps 3 times in 15 years, always briefly, always with the sense that she was studying me rather than speaking to me. Margaret had known. She had seen something in that woman that I had been too polite or too oblivious to notice. I set the letter down and closed my eyes. The paper trembled in my grip, and I felt the room tilt slightly around me as decades of assumptions crumbled into dust. You knew, Margaret. You knew they would come. How long have you been preparing for this war? I did not leave Eleanor's office that morning. There was too much to process, too many questions multiplying in my mind like cracks spreading through concrete. Margaret's letter had opened a door I did not know existed, and behind that door was a darkness I was only beginning to comprehend. But before I could chase ghosts from 20 years past, I had a more immediate problem. The documents Melissa had left on my kitchen counter, the papers she had so casually mentioned needing my signature for, were still sitting in the folder I had grabbed on my way out of the house. I had taken them almost as an afterthought, a habit from decades of reviewing contracts before signing anything. Now I handed the folder to Eleanor and watched her face as she began to read. She spread the pages across the conference table with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime dissecting legal language. Her reading glasses caught the overhead light as she leaned forward, her lips moving slightly as she absorbed each clause. I sat across from her in silence, watching her expression shift from professional concentration to something harder, something colder. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes held a question that made my stomach turn. She asked me when I had signed these documents. I told her I had never signed them. I had never seen them before yesterday. The folder had appeared on my counter after Melissa's visit, tucked between junk mail and grocery circulars, as if it belonged there. I had not even opened it until this morning. Eleanor turned the papers toward me and pointed to the signature line on the final page. There was my name written in what appeared to be my own handwriting, dated 3 weeks prior. The signature authorized a loan guarantee for $180,000, secured against my home as collateral. If the borrower defaulted, the bank would take my house. The borrower listed was a limited liability company I had never heard of, but the registered agent was someone I recognized, Melissa Carter. I stared at my own name on that page and felt a strange dissociation, as if I were looking at a photograph of someone who merely resembled me. I told Eleanor again, more firmly this time, that I had not signed this document. I had not authorized any loan. I had not agreed to risk my home for any purpose. Eleanor made a phone call. Within 2 hours, a handwriting analyst arrived at the office, a quiet woman with sharp eyes who spent 40 minutes examining the signature under magnification, comparing it to samples I provided on the spot. Her conclusion was delivered without drama, but with absolute certainty. The signature was a forgery. A skilled one, practiced enough to fool a casual observer, but structurally inconsistent with my natural hand movements. Someone had studied my signature carefully and reproduced it with patience and precision. I absorbed this information the way I had learned to absorb bad news over the years, with stillness rather than explosion. 40 years of engineering had taught me that panic solves nothing, that the bridge does not care about your emotions when the load calculations are wrong. I asked Eleanor what this meant legally. She told me forgery of this magnitude was a felony in our state, carrying a potential sentence of 5 to 10 years in prison. Whoever had signed my name to these documents had committed a serious crime. My first thought, God help me, was of Daniel. My son's wife had orchestrated this, but had my son participated? Had he known? Had he held the pen himself, practicing my signature at the kitchen table while Emma slept upstairs? The thought made me physically ill. I told Eleanor that I did not want my son in prison. I wanted evidence. I wanted to understand who was truly behind this and why. I wanted to know the full scope of what I was facing before I made any decisions about prosecution. Eleanor warned me that the forgery was too sophisticated for Melissa to have managed alone. This required practice planning access to documents bearing my genuine signature and knowledge of banking procedures. Someone with experience had guided this operation, someone who had done this before. I asked her a question that had been forming in my mind since I first saw those papers. If they tried to make me sign more documents in the future, how could I ensure those signatures would be invalid without alerting them? Eleanor's expression shifted, and for the first time that morning, she almost smiled. She told me there were several techniques, some technical and some procedural. She opened her desk drawer and withdrew a pen that looked ordinary but contained ink with special properties. She explained how certain signatures could be rendered legally void through deliberate errors invisible to the untrained eye. She was teaching me to fight back. Then she returned to the loan documents, spreading them across her desk once more. She studied the financial structure, the routing numbers, the pattern of entities involved. I watched her face drain of color, watched her hands go still on the pages. She looked up at me with an expression I had never seen from her before. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I've seen this exact pattern before. 20 years ago, in a case that nearly destroyed your wife's career." Eleanor did not speak for a long moment. She sat with the documents spread before her, her fingers tracing the edges of the pages as if reading something invisible written there. I watched her face and saw the past moving behind her eyes, memories surfacing that she had clearly hoped would stay buried. When she finally began to explain, her voice had changed, carrying the weight of something she had carried alone for more than 2 decades. She told me that 25 years ago she had been Margaret's junior associate at the firm where my wife built her reputation. Eleanor was fresh out of law school then, idealistic and overwhelmed, and Margaret had taken her under her wing when the other partners dismissed her as too young, too inexperienced, too female to matter. Margaret had been her mentor, her protector, and her closest professional confidant. And during that time, Margaret had uncovered something that would define both their careers. There was another attorney at the firm, Eleanor continued, a woman named Patricia Whitmore. She was brilliant, charming, and utterly without conscience. Patricia had been embezzling from client trust accounts for years, small amounts, at first, then larger sums as her confidence grew. She had constructed an elaborate system of shell companies and falsified records to hide her theft, a system so sophisticated that it had gone undetected for nearly a decade. But Margaret noticed discrepancies that others had missed. Margaret always noticed. The investigation took 6 months. Margaret documented everything with the meticulous precision that had made her one of the finest attorneys of her generation. When she finally presented her findings to the state bar, the evidence was overwhelming. Patricia Whitmore was disbarred, criminally prosecuted, and sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for wire fraud. She lost her license, her reputation, her marriage, and her home. On the day of her sentencing, she stood in the courtroom and looked directly at Margaret. Eleanor had been there. She remembered every word Patricia spoke. "This is not over," Patricia had said. "You think you have won, but you have only started a clock. I will take everything from you. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday when you have forgotten to be afraid, I will be there, and I will make sure you watch it all burn." I felt the air leave my lungs as the implications settled over me. Eleanor continued explaining that Margaret had taken the threat seriously at first, but years passed without incident. Patricia served her sentence and disappeared from public view. Margaret's career flourished. Life moved forward. Eventually, the threat faded into the background noise of distant memory. But Margaret never entirely forgot. Eleanor recalled a conversation they had shared just a year before Margaret's diagnosis when my wife had said something that puzzled her at the time. "I understand what it means to be forgiven," Margaret had told her. Eleanor found it strange because Margaret was the most ethically rigid person she had ever known. What could Margaret have possibly needed forgiveness for? Eleanor turned to her computer and began typing. She explained that she was running a background check, something she should have done years ago but never had cause to pursue. Within minutes, the screen filled with information that rearranged everything I thought I knew about my family. Melissa's maiden name was Whitmore. Her mother was listed as Patricia Ann Whitmore, age 66, current residence unlisted. The same Patricia Whitmore who had sworn revenge on my wife a quarter-century ago. The same Patricia Whitmore whose daughter had married my son 15 years later. I sat in that leather chair and felt the architecture of my life shift beneath me. 15 years. Melissa had been part of our family for 15 years. She had stood beside Daniel at their wedding while I walked her down the aisle because her own father had passed away. She had held my hand at Margaret's funeral and wept what I believed were genuine tears. She had called me Dad with a warmth that made me believe she loved me. Every holiday meal, every birthday celebration, every quiet Sunday dinner had been a performance. I had welcomed a weapon into my home and called her daughter. The worst part was not the betrayal itself. The worst part was realizing that none of it had ever been about me. I was collateral damage in a war I did not know was being fought. Patricia's hatred was for Margaret, and Margaret was beyond her reach, now safe in death from any earthly revenge. So Patricia had done the only thing left to her. She had sent her daughter to destroy what remained of Margaret's legacy, her family, her husband, her son, her granddaughter. Everything Margaret had loved Patricia intended to take. I asked Eleanor what we should do. She leaned forward across the desk, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that reminded me powerfully of Margaret in her prime. She told me they would come for me again. They would pressure me to sign more documents, make more guarantees, surrender more control. They believed I was a foolish old man who would eventually capitulate out of love for my son and granddaughter. This time, she said, we let them think they have won. We give them enough rope to reveal the full scope of their plan. We need to see how deep this conspiracy goes before we can tear it out by the roots. I returned home 3 days later following Eleanor's instructions precisely. I did not call Daniel. I did not reach out to Melissa. I simply resumed my life as though nothing had changed, as though I had taken my peaceful week at the coast and returned refreshed and ready to be the agreeable father they expected. The bait was set. Now I had to wait for them to take it. They didn't make me wait long. The following Saturday, Daniel called to propose a reconciliation dinner at my house. His voice carried the rehearsed warmth of someone following a script, and I recognized Melissa's influence in every carefully chosen word. He said they wanted to apologize for the misunderstanding before my trip. He said Emma missed her grandfather terribly. He said family was too important to let small disagreements create distance. I agreed to the dinner without hesitation, playing my role as the forgiving patriarch eager to restore harmony. Eleanor had prepared me well. The trap required patience, and patience was something I had learned across 40 years of building structures designed to outlast generations. Melissa arrived that evening carrying a casserole dish and wearing a smile so sweet it could have caused cavities. She called me Dad 4 times before she even set the dish on the counter, each utterance dripping with manufactured affection. Daniel followed behind her with Emma, who broke free from her parents immediately and ran to wrap her arms around my waist. Her embrace was the only genuine thing in that house, and I held her tightly, breathing in the innocent smell of her shampoo and wondering how I would protect her from the poison that surrounded her. Dinner was a performance worthy of theater. Melissa complimented my home, my cooking, my wisdom, my generosity. She laughed at jokes I did not make and nodded sympathetically at stories I did not tell. Daniel watched her with something between admiration and exhaustion, clearly grateful that someone else was managing the emotional labor of this charade. I played along, nodding and smiling, letting them believe their flattery was working. After dessert, Melissa produced a folder from her oversized purse with the casual confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment. She explained that she and Daniel had been thinking about Emma's future, about college costs, and the importance of financial planning. They had created an education fund, she said, and they wanted me to be part of it. All I needed to do was sign a few simple documents authorizing a small contribution from my accounts. For Emma's sake. For the family. I took the folder and examined the papers with the careful attention of a man who had spent his career reading technical specifications. The language was dense with legal jargon, but I understood enough to recognize what I was looking at. This was not a contribution to an education fund. This was authorization for Melissa to access my financial accounts directly to make withdrawals and transfers without my knowledge or consent. The amount referenced was not small. It was everything. I asked to borrow a pen. Melissa handed me one from her purse, but I waved it away with a small smile. I told her I preferred my own, an old habit from my engineering days when signatures on blueprints carried life and death weight. She shrugged, unconcerned. I retrieved the pen Eleanor had given me from my shirt pocket, a ordinary-looking instrument that contained ink engineered to fade completely within 72 hours, unless treated with a specific chemical compound. I signed my name with steady hands, knowing that within 3 days that signature would vanish like morning frost, leaving behind nothing but blank paper and Melissa's frustrated confusion. After the dishes were cleared, I asked if I could speak with Emma alone for a few minutes. Melissa hesitated, something flickering behind her eyes, but Daniel said it was fine. Grandpa and Emma needed their special time. I led my granddaughter to the back porch where the evening light was soft and golden. I had something for her, I said, reaching into my pocket. I pulled out an old smartphone, one of my spares, simple and sturdy. Her eyes widened with excitement. I showed her the red button on the screen. "This is just for us, sweetheart," I told her. "If you ever miss Grandpa, you press this button and record a message for me. Tell me about your day, your friends, your dreams. I will listen every night before I go to sleep." Emma clutched the phone to her chest and promised she would record something every single day. She did not understand, could not understand that I was giving her a tool that might one day save us both. As they prepared to leave, I walked them to the door and watched Melissa step onto the porch while Daniel buckled Emma into the car. Melissa's phone rang and she answered it without checking the screen. Her voice dropping to a murmur she thought I could not hear, but the evening was quiet and sound carries in stillness. He signed it. "Mom," she said. "What is the next step?" I could not hear every word of the response, but Patricia's voice was clear enough, cold and sharp as a surgical blade. "Guardianship. We need a doctor to declare him mentally incompetent. Once we have that, we control everything." Melissa ended the call and turned back to wave goodbye, her smile bright and poisonous. I raised my hand in return, my face revealing nothing of the ice spreading through my chest. I stood frozen in that doorway long after their taillights disappeared into the darkness. They were not just after my money. They were planning to take away my freedom, my dignity, my right to make my own decisions. They wanted to lock me in a cage of their own design and call it care. I called Eleanor the next morning before the sun had fully risen. My voice was steady, but my hands were not, and I told her everything I had overheard on my porch. Guardianship, mental incompetence. The clinical precision of Patricia's instructions still echoed in my ears, each word a brick in the prison they were building around me. Eleanor listened without interruption, and when I finished, she told me it was time. Time for me to understand what Margaret had truly left behind. I drove to her office through empty streets, the world still gray with early light. Eleanor was waiting with coffee and a thick folder that bore my wife's handwriting on the tab. She sat me down across from her desk and opened the folder with the reverence of someone handling sacred texts. What she revealed over the next hour changed everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my family, and the woman I had loved for 4 decades. Margaret had established a trust 10 years before her death, Eleanor explained. Not a simple inheritance document, but a conditional trust with provisions that anticipated exactly the kind of threat we now faced. The conditions were not financial thresholds or age requirements. They were behavioral. The trust specified that if any family member, particularly a daughter-in-law or her relatives, engaged in financial exploitation, fraud, undue influence, or elder abuse against me, the entire estate would transfer immediately and irrevocably to a charitable foundation bearing Margaret's name. The family would receive nothing. Every asset, every account, every property would pass beyond their reach forever. I asked Eleanor how Margaret could have known. How could she have anticipated this specific danger so many years before it materialized? Eleanor's expression grew heavier as she opened a second folder. This one filled with documents I had never seen. Printouts of surveillance reports, photographs taken from a distance, timeline charts mapping years of careful observation. Margaret had hired a private investigator during the final years of her life, Eleanor told me. She had suspected Patricia Whitmore was planning something, and she had been determined to understand the shape of the threat before it arrived. What the investigator found was worse than suspicion. It was confirmation of a conspiracy 15 years in the making. Patricia had tracked Daniel from his college years, monitoring his social circles, his romantic relationships, his career trajectory. She had identified him as Margaret's only child, the sole heir to everything Margaret and I had built together. And then she had orchestrated a meeting that Daniel believed was chance, but was anything but. Melissa appeared in Daniel's life at a coffee shop near his office, a beautiful stranger who laughed at his jokes and shared his taste in music. Within 6 months, they were engaged. Within a year, they were married. And throughout that entire courtship, Patricia had been coaching her daughter on exactly how to infiltrate and exploit our family. I sat with this information and felt something crack inside me. Not my heart, which had already endured so much, something deeper, the foundation of memory itself. Every moment I had shared with Melissa now required re-examination. Every smile, every embrace, every time she called me Dad with apparent affection. Had any of it been real? Had there ever been a genuine human being beneath the performance, or had I spent 15 years loving a mask designed by her mother? And beneath that question lay an even more painful one. Did Melissa ever truly love Daniel, or had my son spent his entire marriage bound to a woman who saw him only as a means to an end? I thought of Daniel's face at family gatherings, the quiet pride he took in his wife, the way he looked at her as though she had hung the moon. Had he ever had a chance to find real love? Or had Patricia stolen that possibility from him before he even knew what was being taken? Eleanor seemed to read my thoughts. She mentioned something that had surfaced in the investigation, a comment Melissa had made to Daniel early in their relationship. My mother said, "From the moment I met you, that you were perfect for me." At the time, Daniel had found it romantic proof that even Melissa's mother approved of their love. Now those words carried a different weight entirely. Not romantic, operational. Instructions from a handler to an asset confirming successful target acquisition. I asked Eleanor what options we had. She closed the folders and folded her hands on the desk, her expression grave. She told me that one condition of Margaret's trust had already been violated. The forged signature on the loan documents constituted financial exploitation. I had the legal right to activate the transfer immediately. Every asset would flow to the foundation, and Patricia's entire scheme would collapse into dust, but there was a cost. Eleanor's voice dropped lower, and I heard the warning in her tone before she spoke the words. If you activate the transfer now, Daniel loses everything too, not just Melissa. Daniel. He is still legally her husband. Their finances are intertwined. If the estate transfers to the foundation, your son will be left with nothing. He will lose his home, his savings, his daughter's security, everything. I stared at her across that desk and understood the impossible choice Margaret had left me: protect myself and destroy my son, or protect my son and remain vulnerable to the people trying to destroy us both. The invitation arrived 3 days later, delivered through Daniel in a voice that carried no warmth. Melissa's mother was visiting from out of town, he explained, and they were hosting a family dinner to introduce her properly. His words were careful, rehearsed, and utterly devoid of the awareness that I already knew exactly who Patricia Whitmore was. I accepted the invitation without hesitation. Eleanor had advised me to maintain the appearance of ignorance, to let them believe their deceptions remained intact. But I would be lying if I said I was not curious to finally meet the architect of my family's destruction face to face. I arrived at Daniel's house that evening carrying a bottle of wine I had no intention of drinking. The front door opened before I could knock, and there she stood, Patricia Whitmore. 66 years old, immaculately dressed in charcoal gray, her silver hair styled with precision, her posture radiating the controlled elegance of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of appearing harmless. She extended her hand and introduced herself with a smile that never reached her eyes. I shook it and felt the coldness of her palm, dry and papery like touching something long dead. Dinner was an exercise in endurance. Patricia positioned herself directly across from me at the table, ensuring I could not escape her gaze throughout the meal. She asked questions about my health with exaggerated concern, commenting on how difficult it must be to manage a house alone at my age. She wondered aloud whether I had been feeling confused lately, whether I sometimes forgot where I put things or lost track of conversations. Each comment was delivered with the appearance of kindness, but I recognized the strategy beneath the surface. She was establishing a narrative of decline, planting seeds in Daniel's mind that would later bloom into justification for guardianship. Melissa played her supporting role flawlessly, nodding along with her mother's observations and adding small anecdotes about times I'd supposedly repeated myself or seemed disoriented. None of these incidents had ever occurred, but the lies flowed from her lips with such practiced ease that I wondered if she had even retained the ability to distinguish truth from fabrication. Daniel sat beside his wife silent, his eyes fixed on his plate as though the answers to impossible questions might be found among the roasted vegetables. The cruelest moment came during dessert. Patricia set down her fork and looked at me with an expression of theatrical sympathy. She spoke directly, abandoning all pretense of subtlety. She said that Margaret must have been a remarkable woman, that it was such a tragedy she had passed so young. Then her voice hardened almost imperceptibly, and she delivered words that will stay with me until I die. Margaret thought she won when she destroyed my career, Patricia said. Look around you, Mr. Carter. I have your son, I have your granddaughter, and soon I will have everything Margaret tried to protect. She has been dead 3 years and I am still winning. The table fell silent. I looked at Daniel, willing him to speak, to defend his mother's memory, to show some sign that the boy I had raised still existed somewhere inside the man he had become. But Daniel said nothing. He stared at his plate with the concentration of someone trying to disappear. In that silence, I saw the truth more clearly than any evidence Eleanor could have provided. My son had chosen. Whether through fear or weakness or genuine corruption, he had aligned himself with the family that was systematically dismantling his own. Emma watched everything from the corner of the dining room, her small body pressed against the wall, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She did not understand the words being spoken, but children sense emotional violence even when they cannot name it. I caught her gaze and tried to smile reassuringly, but I'm not certain I succeeded. I left shortly after, claiming fatigue in a voice that required no acting. Patricia walked me to the door with Melissa trailing behind both women, radiating satisfaction at what they perceived as my humiliation. I drove home through dark streets with my hands trembling on the steering wheel, not from fear, but from the effort of containing a rage I could not afford to release. The phone rang at 11 that night. I recognized the number immediately, the old smartphone I had given Emma. Her voice came through small and frightened, barely above a whisper. She told me she was calling from her closet so no one would hear. She said she was scared of Grandma Patricia, that the way Patricia looked at me made her feel like something bad was happening. She said Patricia looked at me like I was bad, but I was not bad, was I? I told her, no, sweetheart, Grandpa is not bad. I told her that sometimes adults have disagreements that are complicated and confusing, but none of it was her fault, and none of it changed how much I loved her. I reminded her about the red button on her phone, about how she could record messages from me whenever she felt alone or worried. If she ever heard something that frightened her, she could record it and send it to me. I would always listen. I would always be there. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she whispered something that made my grip tighten on the phone until my knuckles went white. I record things all the time now, Grandpa. It makes me feel less alone. I closed my eyes in the darkness of my bedroom and felt the weight of that confession settle over me. An 8-year-old girl, frightened and isolated in her own home, had been documenting everything around her. She might hold the key to everything. The week that followed was the longest of my life. I went through the motions of ordinary existence, buying groceries, paying bills, tending the garden Margaret had planted years ago, but my mind was never present in those tasks. I was waiting for Patricia's next move, waiting for the guardianship papers to arrive, waiting for the final blow that would strip away everything I had left. I checked my phone constantly, hoping for a message from Emma, some small reassurance that she was safe and still thinking of her grandfather. When the notification finally came, it was not what I expected. The voice message arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, the icon glowing on my screen like a small miracle. I pressed play and heard Emma's voice, breathless and frightened, tumbling over itself in the way children speak when they are trying to confess something they believe is wrong. Grandpa? She said I accidentally pressed the red button when Mommy was talking to Grandma Patricia. I heard them say mean things about you. I'm sorry. I did not mean to spy. My finger hovered over the screen. There was more. Emma had attached an audio file nearly 12 minutes long. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair and pressed play, not knowing that what I was about to hear would change everything. The recording was muffled at first, the sounds of a room captured from inside a pocket or beneath a pillow. Then the voices clarified, Patricia's sharp and commanding, Melissa's softer but equally cold. They were discussing logistics. They were discussing me. Patricia spoke first, outlining the timeline with the precision of a military strategist. She had already identified a doctor willing to sign a dementia diagnosis in exchange for a substantial fee. The paperwork was being prepared for emergency guardianship, citing my supposed cognitive decline and inability to manage my own affairs. Once the guardianship was approved, they would gain immediate control over my finances, my property, my medical decisions. The house would be sold within 60 days. The proceeds would be distributed according to a plan Patricia had clearly designed long before this conversation. But it was what came next that stopped my breath entirely. Daniel might resist, Melissa said, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty I had rarely heard from her. He still has some attachment to his father. Patricia's response was immediate and brutal. If Daniel causes problems, we use Emma. We threaten full custody. He will fall in line rather than risk losing his daughter. Men like him always do. They are weak when it comes to their children. I heard my granddaughter's voice break through the recording, then small and confused, speaking to herself in the way children do when they are trying to make sense of a world that has stopped making sense. "Grandpa is not sick," she whispered. "Why do they keep saying he is sick?" The innocence of her confusion shattered something inside me. This child, this beautiful 8-year-old girl, who still believed in goodness and fairness and the protection of adults who loved her, had stumbled into a conspiracy that threatened to destroy everyone she cared about. She did not understand what she had captured. She only knew that the people she trusted were saying cruel things about her grandfather, and her small heart could not reconcile that cruelty with the love she felt for me. I drove to Eleanor's office that afternoon with the recording saved to my phone. She listened in silence, her face growing more grave with each passing minute. When it ended, she sat back in her chair and exhaled slowly. She explained the legal limitations first. The recording could not be used in criminal court because it was made by a minor without the consent of the parties being recorded. We could not prosecute Patricia or Melissa based on this evidence alone. But Eleanor's eyes held something other than defeat. She told me this recording served a different purpose entirely. It would not send them to prison, but it would make Daniel listen. It would force him to confront the truth about the woman he had married and the mother-in-law he had welcomed into his life. It would make him choose. I asked her if she thought Daniel would choose correctly. She did not answer. Some questions have no answers until the moment of decision arrives. I sat in my car outside Eleanor's office for a long time, watching the afternoon light fade into evening. My phone felt heavy in my hand, weighted with the evidence of betrayal and the burden of what I now had to do. I thought of Daniel as a boy riding on my shoulders at the county fair, laughing with pure joy. I thought of him as a young man, nervous and proud on his wedding day. I thought of him at Margaret's funeral, weeping against my shoulder while I held him the way I had when he was small. Then I dialed his number. "Daniel," I said when he answered, "I need to see you. Alone, without Melissa. There is something you need to hear, and it is going to break your heart." Daniel arrived at my house the following evening with anger already burning in his eyes. He didn't knock. He walked through the front door as though he still lived here, as though the years had not created distance between us that felt wider than any ocean. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched at his sides, and before I could speak a single word, he launched into an accusation that he had clearly been rehearsing during the entire drive. He told me he knew what I was doing. He said Melissa had warned him that I was becoming paranoid, that I was inventing conspiracies to drive a wedge between him and his wife. He accused me of trying to destroy his marriage because I could not accept that he had built a life separate from me. He asked what kind of father sabotages his own son's happiness out of loneliness and spite. I let him finish. I did not defend myself. I did not argue or explain or plead for understanding. When the last of his accusations had exhausted themselves, and he stood there breathing heavily in my living room, I simply reached for my phone. I told him to sit down. I told him there was something he needed to hear. And then I pressed play. The recording filled the room with Patricia's voice, cold and clinical, outlining the plan to have me declared mentally incompetent. Daniel's face shifted as he listened, confusion replacing anger, then confusion giving way to something darker. But he didn't truly break until he heard them discuss his daughter. If Daniel causes problems, we threaten custody. He will fall in line. The color drained from my son's face. He leaned forward as though he had been struck in the stomach, his hands gripping his knees, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He listened to his wife and mother-in-law discuss Emma as a bargaining chip, a tool to control him a piece on a board game they had been playing for years without his knowledge. When the recording ended with Emma's small voice asking why they kept saying Grandpa was sick, Daniel made a sound I had never heard from him before. It was not quite a sob. It was the sound of something fundamental collapsing inside a man who had believed himself safe. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Daniel sat with his head in his hands, shoulders shaking, the weight of 15 years of deception crushing down on him all at once. I watched my son and felt no triumph in his pain. I felt only the hollow ache of a father who had hoped until the very end that this moment would never have to come. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red and wet. He asked me how long I had known. I told him the truth. I had suspected something was wrong for years, but the evidence had only come together recently. Margaret had suspected too. She had prepared for this possibility long before either of us fully understood the threat. I retrieved the second envelope from the desk drawer where I had kept it since Eleanor first placed it in my hands. The paper was yellowed slightly with age, Margaret's handwriting still elegant across the front. For Daniel when he is ready. I held it out to my son. He stared at the envelope as though it might burn him, then he shook his head and pushed it back toward me. He said he did not deserve to read anything from his mother. He had failed her. He had failed me. He had let them into our family and defended them at every turn while they plotted to destroy everything she had built. He could not face her words knowing what he had allowed to happen. I set the envelope on the table between us and turned toward the photograph of Margaret that had stood on the mantel since the day she died. Her smile looked back at me frozen in a moment of happiness from decades ago, before illness, before loss, before any of this darkness had touched our lives. I spoke softly, almost to myself, but loud enough for Daniel to hear. Margaret, I said I forgave you all those years ago. I suppose I can try to forgive our son too. Daniel's head snapped up. His voice cracked when he spoke. Forgave Mom. For what I looked at him, at this man who was still somehow my little boy, despite everything, and I saw the confusion written across his face. There were secrets in this family that Daniel had never known, truths about his mother that I had protected him from for 30 years. Perhaps one day he would be ready to understand. But not tonight. Tonight there was only one truth that mattered. I met his eyes and spoke clearly. One day you will understand, but right now you have to decide. Your wife or your daughter. You cannot protect both anymore. Melissa and Patricia will use Emma against you the moment you resist them. You heard it yourself. So, choose Daniel. Choose who you are going to be. Because the man who sat silent at that dinner table while Patricia humiliated your father, that man cannot save anyone. Not himself, not his daughter, not this family. Eleanor moved swiftly in the days that followed. She drafted formal legal warnings to both Patricia and Melissa, documents that outlined the evidence we had gathered and the potential criminal charges they faced. Forgery, fraud, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, attempted theft through guardianship manipulation. The letters were delivered by certified mail, requiring signatures, ensuring neither woman could claim ignorance of what was coming. Eleanor told me this was the moment when predators either retreated or revealed their true nature. Patricia Whitmore was not the retreating kind. Her response arrived within 48 hours, not through lawyers, but through a carefully orchestrated public relations campaign. Patricia called a family meeting with her own relatives, people I had never met. Distant cousins and elderly aunts who still remembered her as the promising young attorney she had once been. She painted herself as a victim of circumstance, a mother watching helplessly as her daughter was manipulated by a controlling husband and his paranoid father. Melissa, she claimed, had been isolated from her own family by Daniel's influence. Everything Melissa had done was under duress, coerced by a household that had turned her against her own mother. Patricia wept convincingly. I was told later her performance polished by decades of practice, but Eleanor had anticipated this deflection. She had spent the previous week working with investigators who specialized in digital forensics, people who could recover deleted emails and reconstruct communication trails that ordinary eyes would never find. What they discovered changed everything. The email was dated 5 years before Melissa and Daniel ever met. The subject line read simply, "The Carter family, your assignment." I sat in Eleanor's office and read the contents on her computer screen, feeling the last fragments of any sympathy I might have held for Melissa dissolve into cold understanding. Patricia had written to her daughter with the clinical precision of a handler briefing an operative. The email contained detailed research on our family's finances, property holdings, and Margaret's professional history. It outlined the structure of trusts and investments that Patricia had somehow obtained through channels I could not imagine. And it contained explicit instructions that left no room for interpretation. "Daniel Carter is your way in," Patricia had written. "He is the sole heir, unmarried, emotionally accessible. Margaret destroyed my life 25 years ago, and her family will pay for it. This is our chance. Study him, make yourself indispensable to him, marry him if you can. And when the time is right, we take everything they have." The email continued with specific guidance on how Melissa should present herself, what interests to feign, what vulnerabilities to exploit. It read like a manual for infiltration, a blueprint for the systematic destruction of a family that had never done anything to Melissa herself. She had been 19 years old when she received these instructions. She had spent the next 5 years preparing to meet my son, and then 15 more years executing her mother's revenge. Eleanor shared this evidence with Patricia's extended family. The response was immediate and devastating. Cousins who had rallied to Patricia's defense withdrew their support. An elderly aunt who had testified to Patricia's character publicly retracted her statements. Patricia's own brother released a statement distancing himself from her actions, expressing horror at what his sister had become. Within a week, Patricia Whitmore found herself isolated, abandoned by the very people she had tried to manipulate into supporting her. But the most unexpected collapse came from Melissa herself. I learned later what happened in the house she shared with Daniel during those final days. When Melissa discovered that the email had surfaced, that her entire relationship with Daniel had been exposed as a calculated operation rather than a love story, something broke inside her. She confronted Patricia by phone, screaming accusations that neighbors could hear through closed windows. She demanded to know if anything about their relationship had been real, if Patricia had ever loved her as a daughter or only valued her as an instrument of revenge. Patricia's response, according to Daniel, who overheard fragments of the call, was silence. And then a single sentence: "You knew what this was. You always knew." Melissa appeared at my door 3 days later. She came alone without announcement, her face bare of makeup, her eyes swollen from crying, her entire being stripped of the polished confidence that had defined her for as long as I had known her. She looked smaller somehow, diminished like a puppet whose strings had finally been cut. She asked if she could come inside. I stepped back and let her enter, though every instinct warned me this could be another manipulation, another performance designed to exploit my sympathy. She stood in my living room, the same room where she had smiled and lied to me for 15 years, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I need to tell you something. I was taught to hate your family before I ever met them. My mother raised me to see you as enemies, as targets, as obstacles to be removed. Everything I did because she told me it was justice. But now I do not know who I am without that hate. I do not know if there is anything left of me that is real." I looked at Melissa standing in my living room, her confession hanging in the air between us like smoke from a fire that had burned too long. Part of me wanted to rage at her, to unleash years of accumulated betrayal in a torrent of words that would leave her as shattered as she had tried to leave me. Another part, smaller but insistent, recognized something genuine in her brokenness, something that reminded me that victims can become perpetrators, and perpetrators can also be victims. But I was not the one who needed to hear her confession. I told her that whatever she needed to say, she should say it to Daniel, not to me. I was not her priest, her therapist, or her judge. If there was healing to be done, it would happen between husband and wife, between parent and child. I could not manage that process, and I would not try. She needed to face the man she had deceived, the father of her daughter, the person whose love she had exploited most directly. That conversation belonged to them. Melissa looked at me for a long moment, searching my face for something I couldn't give her. Then, she nodded slowly and left without another word. I watched her car pull away and felt nothing but exhaustion. Daniel came to see me 3 days later. He arrived in the late afternoon when the light through my windows had turned golden and soft, carrying the envelope I had offered him once before. Margaret's letter. The one addressed to him, the one he had refused to open because he believed he did not deserve his mother's words. Something had changed in his face since I last saw him. The anger was gone, replaced by a weariness that made him look older than his 42 years. He asked if he could read the letter here in the house where he had grown up, surrounded by the memories of the mother who had written it. I told him, of course. I left him alone in the living room and went to the kitchen to make coffee that neither of us would drink. I heard nothing from the other room for nearly 20 minutes. Then I heard a sound that broke my heart all over again. My son was weeping. When I returned, Daniel was sitting on the couch with the letter in his hands, tears streaming down his face in a way I had not seen since he was a boy. He looked up at me with eyes that held something new, something that looked almost like understanding. He held out the pages toward me, his hand trembling. "You knew," he said. "All these years you knew." I took the letter and read it again, though I had memorized every word long ago. Margaret's handwriting filled the pages, elegant even when discussing the most painful truths. She had written about a time 30 years past a period in our marriage that I had buried so deeply I sometimes forgot it had ever happened. We had been married only 6 years then, Daniel just a toddler, both of us exhausted by the demands of young parenthood and careers that consumed more than they gave. Margaret had met someone at her firm, a senior partner, who made her feel seen in ways I had stopped making her feel. She had not consummated the affair, but she had come close. Close enough that when I discovered the truth, our marriage stood on the edge of an abyss. I had found the letters she had hidden. I had confronted her with evidence of a betrayal that could have ended everything. And then I had made a choice that defined the next 3 decades of my life. I forgave her. Completely. I never mentioned it again, never used it as leverage in arguments, never allowed it to poison the love we rebuilt together. I chose to continue loving her, knowing she was imperfect, knowing she had wounded me, knowing that forgiveness was the only path forward that did not lead to destruction. Margaret wrote to Daniel about this. She explained what I had taught her through my actions rather than my words. Forgiveness is not weakness, she had written. It is the hardest kind of strength. Your father chose to love me knowing I was flawed. He gave me a gift I spent the rest of my life trying to deserve. If you are reading this letter, it means you have made a mistake too. Perhaps a terrible one. Learn what I learned, Daniel. Being forgiven is a gift. Choosing to stay is a choice. And remember that Emma is watching you. She will learn how to love from watching how you love your father. I set the letter down and looked at my son. He was staring at me with an expression I could not quite read, something between awe and grief, and the fragile beginning of hope. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a document I recognized immediately. Separation papers, legal forms that would begin the process of dissolving his marriage to Melissa, of untangling 15 years of shared life and lies. He placed them on the table between us. "I have signed them," he said. "I'm choosing Emma. I'm choosing you, Dad. I'm choosing to stay." The weeks that followed Daniel's decision moved with the slow inevitability of a river carving through stone. Eleanor worked tirelessly negotiating with attorneys Patricia had hired to minimize her exposure, crafting a settlement that would resolve the conflict without the spectacle of a criminal trial. I let her handle the details. I had spent enough of my life building structures that would outlast me. Now, I needed to trust someone else to build this one. The terms Eleanor negotiated were comprehensive and uncompromising. Patricia and Melissa would return every dollar they had misappropriated, including the funds from the fraudulent loan they had secured using my forged signature. They would relinquish all claims to the Carter family estate, present and future, signing documents that severed any legal connection to our finances permanently. The house Margaret and I had built together, the savings we had accumulated across 40 years of marriage, the trust she had established to protect our legacy, all of it would remain beyond their reach forever. But the provision that mattered most to me had nothing to do with money. Patricia Whitmore would be legally barred from any contact with Emma. No visits, no phone calls, no letters, no presence at school events or birthday parties, or any moment of my granddaughter's life. The woman who had orchestrated this conspiracy, who had raised her own daughter as a weapon and aimed her at my family, would never again have the opportunity to poison another generation. In exchange for these concessions, I declined to pursue criminal prosecution. Eleanor explained my reasoning to Daniel the night before the signing, when he asked why I would let Patricia escape prison after everything she had done. I listened from the doorway as Eleanor spoke the words I had asked her to deliver. "Your father could have sent your mother-in-law to prison," she told my son. "The evidence is overwhelming. Forgery alone carries 5 to 10 years. Add conspiracy, fraud, and attempted elder abuse, and Patricia would spend the rest of her life behind bars. But your father chose not to pursue that path. Not because he forgives her, not because he believes she deserves mercy. He chose this for Emma's sake. He does not want your daughter to grow up knowing her grandmother is a convicted felon. He does not want that shadow following her through school, through friendships, through every moment when someone might discover that her family includes a woman in prison. Some victories cost too much. Your father decided this one was not worth the price. Daniel said nothing. He simply nodded, and I saw in his eyes a new understanding of what it meant to make sacrifices for the people you love. The signing took place in Eleanor's conference room on a gray Thursday morning. Patricia arrived with her attorney, a young man who looked uncomfortable in her presence, as if he had taken this case for the fee and now regretted the association. She was dressed impeccably as always, her silver hair perfect, her posture rigid, but something essential had drained from her. The woman who had radiated triumph at that terrible dinner now sat diminished hollow. A general who had lost not just the battle but the entire war she had spent decades preparing to fight. She didn't speak throughout the proceedings. She signed each document where her attorney indicated her pen moving mechanically across the pages, her eyes fixed on some middle distance that held nothing but defeat. When it was finished, she stood and left without looking at any of us, her footsteps echoing down the hallway like the retreat of something that had once seemed invincible. Melissa signed with trembling hands. I watched her struggle to control the shaking, watched her write her name on documents that would sever her from the family she had infiltrated and the scheme she had executed for 15 years. When she finished, she rose slowly and walked toward the door. But before she left, she stopped and looked back at me. There was no hatred in her eyes. There was no anger, no defiance, no plea for sympathy. There was only emptiness, the look of someone who had lost everything, including her sense of self. She had been her mother's weapon for so long that she no longer knew who she was without that purpose. She held my gaze for a long moment, and I saw in her face a question she would spend years trying to answer. Then she turned and walked away, and I never saw her again. After everyone left, I sat alone in Eleanor's conference room. The documents lay signed and witnessed on the table, legal proof that this chapter of our family's nightmare had finally closed. I reached into my pocket and withdrew the photograph of Margaret I had carried with me since the day she died, the one where she was smiling in our garden, surrounded by the flowers she had planted and the life we had built together. I held her image in my hands and spoke to her as I had spoken to her every night for 3 years. I kept my promise, Margaret. Our family is still standing. Our granddaughter is safe. Daniel is finding his way back. And you, my love, you prepared for everything, even this, even them. For the first time since Margaret closed her eyes for the last time, I felt something that might have been peace. The weight I had carried was not gone, but it had shifted, become something I could bear. The war was over. The healing could begin. But I knew even in that moment of quiet relief that recovery would take years. For Daniel, who had to rebuild his understanding of his entire adult life. For Emma, who would grow up with questions that had no easy answers. And for me, who had learned that protecting the people you love sometimes means fighting battles they never know about. 6 months passed, like water finding its way through rock, slowly carving new channels where old paths had been blocked. The world outside my windows cycled through seasons, while the world inside my home transformed in ways both painful and beautiful. Daniel and Emma moved into a modest apartment 3 blocks from my house, close enough that I could walk there on warm evenings, close enough that Emma could ride her bicycle to visit whenever she wanted. The divorce was finalized in early autumn, a stack of papers that officially ended 15 years of a marriage built on leases. Daniel signed them without ceremony, and afterward he told me he felt nothing. Not relief, not grief, just the strange emptiness of closing a book he had not known he was reading. Daniel started therapy that same month. He went twice a week to a small office downtown, where a patient woman helped him understand how he had become complicit in his own deception. He told me fragments of what he was learning, how manipulators identify vulnerabilities and exploit them, how love can become a blindfold that prevents us from seeing what is directly in front of us. He was trying to forgive himself, which I knew from experience was harder than forgiving anyone else. Emma and I developed rituals that became the architecture of our new relationship. Every Saturday morning she came to my house for breakfast, and we would read together from the books Margaret had kept in the study, adventure stories and mysteries, and the poetry Margaret had loved. Afterward, we would bake something from the recipe box Margaret had filled with index cards in her careful handwriting, each one a small piece of her preserved in flour and sugar and the alchemy of heat. Emma learned to measure ingredients with precision, to fold batter gently, to wait with patience, while cookies transformed behind the oven glass. She reminded me so much of Margaret in those moments that sometimes I had to turn away to hide the tears that came without warning. In spring, we began tending Margaret's garden together. The beds had grown wild in the years since her death, neglected first by my grief, and then by the chaos that had consumed our family. Emma and I pulled weeds and turned soil and planted seeds that Margaret had chosen long ago. We talked while we worked about school and friends and the small dramas of being 8 years old in a confusing world. And one afternoon, while we were planting tomatoes in the bed nearest the fence, Emma asked the question I had been dreading since the day her mother walked out of Eleanor's office. "Grandpa," she said, her small hand still holding a seedling, "you hate Mommy?" I set down my trowel and looked at my granddaughter, at her serious eyes, waiting for an answer that would shape how she understood love and forgiveness for the rest of her life. I considered my words carefully, knowing that whatever I said would plant seeds of its own. I told her I was sad more than angry. I explained that her mommy had been taught wrong things by her own mommy, that sometimes people grow up learning to hurt others because that is what they were shown. I told her that what her mommy did was not okay, and that actions have consequences even when we understand why someone made bad choices. But I also told her that I was grateful every single day that I had her in my life, that she was the best thing to come from all of this, and that my love for her would never change no matter what happened. Emma nodded slowly, processing my words with the gravity children bring to matters they sense are important. Then she returned to planting her tomato seedling, and we worked in comfortable silence until the afternoon light began to fade. A week later, Emma brought me a drawing she had made at school. It was a family portrait, the kind children make with bright colors and stick figures standing in front of a simple house. She had drawn 3 people holding hands beneath a yellow sun. "Grandpa," she said, pointing to the tallest figure, "Daddy, and me." There was no fourth figure, no mother standing beside them. Daniel saw the drawing that evening when he came to pick Emma up, and I watched his face crumble as he understood what his daughter had created. "She does not even include Melissa anymore," he said, his voice breaking on his ex-wife's name. I put my hand on his shoulder and spoke gently. "Give her time. Children understand more than we think. She is drawing her family as she experiences it right now. That does not mean she has erased her mother forever. It means she is showing us who makes her feel safe." Daniel wiped his eyes and nodded, tucking the drawing carefully into his jacket to hang on the refrigerator in their small apartment. That evening, the 3 of us shared dinner at my kitchen table, something we had begun doing every Sunday since Daniel and Emma moved nearby. We ate the roast chicken Margaret used to make, following her recipe exactly. And we talked about small things that felt enormous after everything we had survived. When the plates were cleared, Emma made an announcement with the solemnity of someone delivering important news. "When I grow up," she said, "I want to be a lawyer like Mrs. Eleanor, so I can protect good people like Grandpa." Daniel and I exchanged a look across the table, and in that moment, I felt Margaret's presence more strongly than I had since the day she died. Her legacy was taking root in our granddaughter, growing toward a future none of us could have predicted. The weeks following Emma's announcement carried a quiet grace that I had not expected to find again at this stage of my life. I watched my granddaughter approach the world with renewed curiosity, asking questions about what lawyers did, how courts worked, why some people needed protection from others. Eleanor agreed to let Emma visit her office one afternoon, showing her the conference room where important decisions were made, explaining in simple terms how the law could be a shield for those who could not shield themselves. Emma listened with the intensity of a child who has discovered her calling, and I saw in her focus the same determination that had defined Margaret throughout her career. It was during this season of gentle rebuilding that the letter arrived. I found it in my mailbox on an ordinary Tuesday morning, tucked between utility bills and grocery circulars. The envelope was plain white, unremarkable, but the return address stopped me cold. It bore the name of a residential treatment facility 3 states away, a place I had never heard of in a town I could not locate on a map. The handwriting was familiar, though I had not seen it in months. Melissa. I carried the envelope inside and set it on my kitchen table, staring at it for a long time before I found the courage to open it. Part of me wanted to throw it away unread, to refuse whatever manipulation or excuse or plea it might contain. But another part, the part that had learned through Margaret's letter that people are more complicated than their worst actions, needed to know what Melissa had written. The letter was 3 pages long, written in careful script that suggested each word had been chosen deliberately. Mr. Carter, it began. I am not writing to ask you to forgive me. I do not deserve it, and we both know it. I am writing because I need you to understand something not for my sake, but for Emma's. I read on my hands steady despite the tremor in my chest. My mother raised me as a weapon. From the time I was old enough to understand words, she taught me that wealth was everything, that sentiment was weakness, that men existed to be used and discarded. She told me stories about the woman who had destroyed her career, who had stolen her future, who deserved to suffer for what she had done. I did not know Margaret's name until I was 19 years old. But I knew her face, her history, her family. I knew everything about her because my mother made certain I would never forget the target she had chosen for me. I believed her. I believed every word she spoke, every lesson she taught, every instruction she gave. I believed that infiltrating your family was justice, that taking everything from you was righteous revenge for crimes Margaret had committed before I was born. I was wrong. I was wrong about everything. The letter continued, and I found myself unable to stop reading. I'm in treatment now. Not because anyone forced me, and not because I'm trying to earn your sympathy. I'm here because 3 months ago I watched my daughter speak to a classmate who had less than she did. I watched Emma dismiss that child with a wave of her hand and a comment about people who do not matter. And I recognized the gesture. I recognized the tone. I recognized the cruelty. Because it was my cruelty, learned from my mother, passed down like a disease through generations of women who taught their daughters to see other human beings as obstacles or opportunities. I could not let that happen. I could not let Emma become what I became. So I checked myself into this facility, and I have spent every day since trying to understand who I am without the hatred my mother planted in me. It is the hardest thing I have ever done. Some days I'm not sure there is anything underneath the person she created. Some days I think I am hollow all the way through. The final page was the hardest to read. I'm not asking to see Emma. I know I have lost that right, and I accept the consequences of what I have done. But I'm asking you for one thing, Mr. Carter. If Emma ever asks about me, please do not tell her I was evil. Tell her I was lost. Tell her I was raised by someone who taught me to hate, and that I am trying for the first time in my life to learn something different. Tell her that I loved her, even if I did not know how to show it. Tell her that she deserves a mother who is whole, and that I am trying to become that person, even if it takes the rest of my life. The letter was signed simply with her name. No apology. No request for reconciliation. No manipulation disguised as vulnerability. Just the raw confession of a woman who had finally seen herself clearly and could not bear what she found. I sat with the letter for a long time after I finished reading. The afternoon light shifted across my kitchen table, marking the passage of hours I didn't notice. I thought about Patricia, who had forged her daughter into a weapon without caring what it would cost. I thought about Melissa, who had spent her entire life serving a purpose that was never her own. And I thought about Emma, who carried genes from both of them, who could so easily follow the same path if no one intervened. I did not respond to the letter. I didn't know what I would say, and I wasn't certain any response would help either of us. But I didn't destroy it either. Instead, I carried it to my bedroom and opened the wooden box where I kept Margaret's most precious keepsakes, her wedding ring, a lock of her hair, the last birthday card she ever gave me. I placed Melissa's letter among these treasures and closed the lid. Maybe forgiveness starts here, I whispered to the empty room. Maybe it does not, but at least it is not hate anymore. Daniel found the letter 2 weeks later. He had come to help me organize Margaret's study, a project we had been postponing for years, and he discovered the envelope while sorting through papers I had left on my desk. He read it without asking permission, and when he finished, he looked at me with an expression I could not quite decipher. "What are you going to do with this?" he asked. I took the letter gently from his hands and returned it to its place among Margaret's keepsakes. "I will keep it," I told him, "until Emma is old enough to decide for herself what kind of relationship she wants with her mother. That choice belongs to her, not to us, and when she is ready to make it, she will have all the information she needs." The year that followed was the quietest of my life, and I mean that as the highest compliment time can receive. Seasons turned with their ancient rhythm, spring softening into summer, summer deepening into autumn, autumn surrendering to the first whispers of winter. And through it all, the three of us learned how to be a family again. Not the family we had been before, not the family we had imagined we would become, but something new and perhaps stronger for having been tested by fire. Daniel found work at a small firm downtown. Nothing glamorous, but honest. The kind of steady employment that allowed him to rebuild not just his finances but his sense of self. The therapist he continued to see helped him understand the patterns that had made him vulnerable to manipulation, the childhood wounds that Melissa had exploited without his awareness. He was learning to trust himself again, and watching that process unfold was one of the great privileges of my 7th decade. Emma flourished in ways that continually surprised me. Her teachers sent home glowing reports about her kindness, her curiosity, her unusual capacity for empathy in a child so young. She had developed a habit of befriending the loneliest children in her class, seeking out those who sat alone at lunch or lingered at the edges of the playground. When I asked her why, she told me simply that everyone deserves someone who sees them. I recognized Margaret in those words, in that instinct toward compassion that seemed to arise from somewhere deeper than teaching. And I tended Margaret's garden through every season, watching it bloom and fade and prepare for rebirth. The tomatoes Emma and I had planted together produced abundantly that summer, and we spent long afternoons canning sauce using Margaret's handwritten recipe. The garden had become my conversation with my wife, the place where I spoke to her, and sometimes in the rustle of leaves or the scent of flowers she had chosen felt her answer. My 70th birthday arrived on a December morning that dawned gray and cold, the sky heavy with clouds that seemed to press down on the world like a soft blanket. I had not planned to celebrate. Birthdays after a certain age feel less like achievements and more like survival's markers of endurance rather than milestones of joy. I had intended to spend the day quietly, perhaps reading by the fire, perhaps visiting Margaret's grave to tell her I had made it another year. But Daniel and Emma had other ideas. When I came downstairs that morning, still in my robe, I found my kitchen transformed. Streamers hung from the ceiling in soft blues and silvers that caught the morning light. Balloons clustered in the corners. A cake sat on the counter, homemade and slightly lopsided, decorated with more candles than the frosting could reasonably support. And 2 faces beamed at me from behind the kitchen island, both radiating conspiratorial delight at having surprised me. Emma ran to embrace me, her arms wrapping around my waist with fierce strength. "Happy birthday, Grandpa," she said into my chest. "We made you a cake. Daddy let me crack the eggs." Daniel smiled from across the room, and in that smile I saw the boy he had been before Melissa, before Patricia, before any of the darkness that had nearly consumed us. He had found his way back to himself, and the journey had changed him in ways that made him better rather than bitter. Eleanor arrived shortly after noon carrying a wrapped package that she placed in my hands with unusual solemnity. She told me this was something Margaret had wanted me to have, something she had been working on during the final years of her life, but had not lived to see completed. Eleanor had spent the past year finishing what Margaret started, and now it was finally ready. I unwrapped the package carefully, feeling the weight of it, before I saw what it contained. A book, its cover, elegant and simple, bearing Margaret's name above the title, Foundations of Family Essays on Law, Ethics, and the Bonds That Hold Us Together. A collection of her writings spanning decades compiled from articles, speeches, and the private journals she had kept throughout her career. Eleanor had edited everything with the meticulous care Margaret herself would have demanded. I held the book and felt Margaret's presence more powerfully than I had since the morning she died. Her words, her wisdom, her fierce commitment to protecting families, all preserved now in permanent form. Generations of lawyers and ordinary people would read these pages and carry her influence forward. Margaret's legacy had transcended her death in a way that felt almost like resurrection. Emma asked if she could read something aloud. I handed her the book, and Eleanor showed her a passage marked with a silk ribbon, a section from an essay Margaret had written 20 years ago. Emma's voice filled the room, clear and confident despite her age. "Family is not made of people who never hurt each other," she read. "Family is made of people who choose to stay and heal together. We wound the ones we love because we are human, because we are flawed, because intimacy exposes our worst selves alongside our best. But the measure of a family is not whether pain occurs, it is whether love survives the pain. It is whether we choose again and again to remain present for each other, even when remaining is the hardest thing we have ever done. The words hung in the air after Emma finished settling over us like the snow that had begun to drift past the windows. Daniel reached over and took my hand, squeezing it with pressure that communicated everything language could not capture. Gratitude, remorse, love. The complicated tangle of emotions between fathers and sons who have hurt each other and chosen to heal anyway. I squeezed back, and in that simple gesture, I felt the circle complete itself. Emma looked up from the book with the expression she wore when a question was forming the serious focus of a child encountering an idea too large to ignore. "Grandpa," she said, "what is justice?" The question surprised me, though perhaps it should not have. Emma had witnessed more in her 9 years than most children see in a lifetime. She had watched her family nearly destroyed by people she trusted. She deserved an answer that honored her experience. I considered my words carefully. "Justice is not about defeating bad people, sweetheart," I told her. "Justice is not about punishment or revenge. Justice is something quieter than that and much more difficult. Justice is when good people are still whole after the storm passes. It is when you can still believe in love even after you have seen betrayal. It is when your daddy is sitting here with us holding my hand, even though he once got lost in a darkness that was not his fault. Justice is not destruction. Justice is restoration. It is the slow, patient work of putting broken things back together in a way that makes them stronger than they were before." Emma nodded slowly, absorbing my words with the gravity she brought to all important matters. She would think about this answer for years, I knew, testing it against her experience as she grew. Her attention shifted suddenly to the window behind me, and her face transformed with wonder. Snow had begun to fall in earnest, a steady descent of white that softened the edges of the world outside. The flakes were fat and lazy, drifting down through the gray afternoon light, glittering like stars making their slow way to earth. Emma leaped from her chair and ran to the window, pressing her nose against the cold glass, her breath fogging tiny clouds that appeared and vanished with each excited exhale. Her laughter filled the house, bright and pure and utterly unself-conscious, the sound of joy that has not yet learned to doubt itself. I listened to it and felt something ease in my chest that had been tight for longer than I could remember. This was what I had fought for. This was what Margaret had prepared for. This moment, this child, this laughter, echoing through a home that had nearly fallen, but did not. Daniel stood beside me, and we watched his daughter together in comfortable silence. On the mantel across the room, Margaret's photograph smiled at us unchanged after 40 years, her eyes holding the same warmth that had guided me through our entire life together. "Well, Margaret," I whispered quiet enough that only she could hear. "We made it. The family is still standing. Daniel found his way home. The granddaughter is safe and full of light, and the love you planted in all of us survived everything they tried to do." Grandpa Emma called from the window, "Come look, the snow is so beautiful. It looks like the sky is giving us a present." I smiled and began to rise, but Daniel caught my arm. He looked at me with eyes that held tears he was too proud to let fall. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking, "thank you for not giving up on me, for believing I could find my way back even when I had stopped believing it myself, for forgiving me when I did not deserve forgiveness. I want you to know that I understand now what you and Mom built together, what I almost threw away. I understand, and I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of your faith in me." I placed my hand on my son's shoulder, feeling the solid reality of him, the proof that redemption was possible even after the deepest betrayals. "That is what family does," I told him. "We stay. We fight for each other even when the fighting is hard. We choose love over and over again, even when love costs us everything. Your mother knew that. She wrote about it in the book you are holding, and now you know it too." Daniel embraced me then, the first real embrace we had shared since he was a young man, and I felt the years of distance dissolve between us. We stood there for a long moment, father and son survivors of a war we had not chosen. Grandpa Emma called again. "You are missing it." I released my son and walked to the window where my granddaughter was waiting, her face illuminated by the soft gray light of a winter afternoon. She looked up at me with Margaret's eyes, with the future written in her smile. Justice does not shout. It waits, and when it finally speaks, it sounds like a child's laughter, echoing through a home that almost fell but did not. It sounds like forgiveness offered and accepted. It sounds like snow falling on a December afternoon while a family that once was broken stands together at a window, watching the world transform into something new. Grandpa Emma said, reaching for my hand, "Catch the snowflakes with me." I wrapped my hand around hers, feeling the small bones, the soft skin, the pulse of life that would continue long after I was gone. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the garden Margaret had planted, the world that had tested us and found us stronger than it expected. "Always, sweetheart," I said. "Always." And that is where Robert's story ends, not with vengeance or destruction, but with snow falling outside a window, and a granddaughter's laughter filling a home that almost fell, but did not. I want to take a moment to share some thoughts with you about what we just witnessed, because this story carries lessons that I believe everyone watching needs to hear. What Patricia and Melissa did to Robert was not just about money. It was about control. It was about systematically dismantling a man's dignity, his autonomy, his right to make decisions about his own life. They wanted to declare him mentally incompetent, to strip away his freedom under the guise of care. This is elder abuse, and it happens far more often than most people realize. It happens in wealthy families and poor families. It happens to educated people and simple people. It happens because predators recognize vulnerability and exploit it without mercy. The first lesson from Robert's story is this: trust your instincts. Robert felt something was wrong for years before he had proof. Margaret felt it too. She saw through Melissa's performance when everyone else was charmed. If someone in your life makes you uncomfortable, if their kindness feels rehearsed, if their interest in your finances seems just a little too eager, pay attention to that feeling. Your instincts exist to protect you. Do not dismiss them because you want to believe the best in people. The second lesson is to prepare while you still can. Margaret did something extraordinary. She built protections years before she knew she would need them. She established a trust with conditions. She left letters. She confided in Eleanor and made sure someone outside the family understood what might be coming. If you have assets, if you have a family, if you have anything worth protecting, do not wait until you are under attack to build your defenses. Speak to an attorney. Create documents that protect your wishes. Make sure someone you trust completely knows where everything is and what your intentions are. The time to prepare is now while your mind is clear and your options are open. The third lesson is perhaps the most painful one. Sometimes the people we love become weapons used against us. Daniel was not evil. He was manipulated, isolated, turned against his own father by a woman who had been trained since childhood to destroy. Patricia weaponized her daughter the way some people weaponize religion or patriotism or love itself. She took something that should have been beautiful and made it into a tool for revenge. If you find yourself caught between family members, if you find yourself being asked to choose sides or cut off people who love you, stop and ask yourself who benefits from your isolation. Manipulators thrive when their victims are alone. They fear witnesses. They fear outside perspectives. If someone in your life is systematically separating you from the people who knew you before, that is not love. That is control. The fourth lesson is about forgiveness. And I want to be careful here because forgiveness is complicated. Robert forgave Daniel, but he did not forgive him immediately, and he did not forgive him without conditions. Daniel had to choose. He had to demonstrate through action that he understood what he had done and was committed to change. Forgiveness is not pretending harm did not happen. Forgiveness is not allowing someone to continue hurting you. Forgiveness is releasing the poison of hatred from your own heart while still maintaining boundaries that protect you from future harm. You can forgive someone and still never allow them close enough to hurt you again. Those two things are not contradictions. Finally, I want you to remember what Robert told Emma about justice. Justice is not about defeating bad people. Justice is when good people are still whole after the storm passes. If you are going through something similar to what Robert experienced, if someone is trying to take your money, your freedom, your dignity, your family, I want you to know that survival is victory. Remaining whole is victory. Protecting the people you love while refusing to become bitter or cruel, that is the greatest victory of all. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have your own story of family betrayal or quiet justice, leave it in the comments below. You never know who might find strength in knowing they are not alone. Until next time, this is Revenge Room, reminding you that justice does not shout. It waits, and it always arrives.